This film spans a century that has moulded Russia's tank development through its triumphs and disasters. From the early days, when designs would have looked more at home on an Orson-Wellesian War of the Worlds feature film, to 21st century high-tech solutions to battlefield conflict. En route, we relive the revolution, the harsh Russian winters, the camaraderie, 2 world wars, the Cold War, partisan war, and eventually the decline of the Soviet Union and the birth of a new Russian superpower. Tanks initially proved their worth in the First World War and provoked Comrade Lenin to comment, "The advantage belongs to the one who has the best technology, organisation and machines." And due to such a belief, Russian tank technology advanced at such a phenomenal rate. The sheer scale of the Red Army's tank development is a phenomenon of 20th century military history. At its height of production in the Second World War, tanks were rolling out of the factories at a rate of 1 every 30 minutes. No surprise that the Germans asked, where are all these tanks coming from? From an initial position where Russian tanks were all copies of other countries, the motherland's designers later created groundbreaking innovations that determined the direction of global tank development. Their journey from rivets to casting, welded armour plate to reactive armour, track and suspension to present-day integrated battlefield awareness systems. All this set in such a fascinating period of history. Russia has in fact promoted itself as the birthplace of the tank. Engineer Colonel Mostavenkov, in his 1950s book Tanky, extols the work of a naval designer Mendeleev as the first creator of such a military vehicle project. Mendeleev designed a series of combat vehicles between 1911 and 1915. One weighed 170 tons, projected a 120mm ship's cannon as its primary weapon, had an 8-man crew, and was supposed to reach a top speed of 24 kilometers per hour. However, his designs were all ahead of their time and were subsequently viewed as the work of an active imagination and sadly disregarded. In terms of actual construction, the story of Russian tanks starts in 1913, when the Vickers armoured cars were brought over from England. Taking their heavy-duty chassis, the coach builders clad the body with armoured plate. While they were reasonably robust, they did have serious problems outside of the cities, as their suspension was never designed for the rigours of the Russian country roads.
And these cars, they had between 1 and 2 machine guns on them. They had crews of up to 10 men inside, because they also doubled up as armoured personnel carriers. And these were very crude in the most basic form.
The Russians also liked the vehicles developed by the English Royal Navy Air Service, the best known being the Rolls-Royce armoured cars, which were based on a 40-50 horsepower car chassis and an engine with a maximum output of 80 horsepower. To this, an armoured bodywork was added and a single turret with a Vickers machine gun. The Lanchester was also of interest, and the Russians received 20 of them in 1915. This vehicle had 6 cylinders, a 4.8-litre engine which developed 64 brake horsepower. With 8mm of armour, it weighed between 4 and 5 tons and had a top speed of 50 miles per hour.
The Russians took the Lanchester and the Rolls-Royce armoured cars that they'd been shown by the Royal Naval Air Service and their reliability, and went on to produce some of their own armoured cars. The first one the Russians actually produced is the Austin truck chassis, and that has 2 offset machine gun turrets. And again, you can see them running around during the Russian Revolution. They become very, very popular. They're the first armoured fighting vehicles that the Russian army ever gets.
In the First World War, the Russian High Command were aware of the need to provide armoured protection for their troops and therefore actively sourced new designs. In response, a diverse range of experimental armoured vehicles were designed and tested. They included a number of bizarre ideas. The Vezdakov, or Go Anywhere vehicle, was tracked with just one caterpillar band and was steered by wheels. However, this design, like many others, was never put into production. Other interesting designs included Captain Mebrova's armoured vehicle that was powered by coal, while Captain Poblavko created one that could tear through barbed wire and ram obstructions. But best known of all was designed by Emperor Nicholas II's engineer Kigres, who wrapped the rear wheels with tracks, which greatly improved the vehicle's mobility across difficult terrain. One of the most bizarre designs, however, must have been engineer Lebdenko's idea for breaking through on the Austrian front in 1915 with his giant wheeled tricycle, which the Soviets later named the Tsar's tank.
It's basically a giant trike. It's some 30-odd meters high. It's approximately 30 meters long. 2 giant wheels, spoked wheels at the front, and solid wheels at the rear of the vehicle. Mounted halfway up, about 15 meters off the ground, is the gun platform and driving platform. And in this you've got 4 naval 6-pounders, plus machine guns, plus the captain of the vehicle, because it was treated as a ship of the land rather than the ship of the sea. On this bridge structure between the 2 big wheels, some 20 men in various fighting compartments and ammunition compartments. The engine is back down on the rear, driving directly onto the rear axle of the vehicle. Its top speed is approximately 3.5 miles an hour, and it's using about 8 gallons of fuel per mile. So it's not exactly a cheap and easy vehicle. Steering is almost impossible because it's done by braking the wheels on each side. It's just a great monstrosity. If you've got a vehicle standing sort of nearly 30 meters above you, over 100 feet higher than you are, trundling towards your trench, firing away with 6-pound guns, it's going to frighten the life out of you. Or at least that's what the Tsar hoped. But of course it turned out to be a complete and utter fiasco. Very much a Leonardo type invention. It should never have been allowed on a battlefield.
Following the commencement of the Russian Civil War in 1918, the British Army supplied the White Army with Mark IV and Mark V tanks that had seen action during the Great War. The British interventionist forces, as they were known, preferred the idea of dealing with the old guard rather than the new revolutionary Bolsheviks. In addition to the Mark IV and Vs, they were also examples of the Renault FT-17 and others, including the British Whippet. This vehicle weighed in at 14 tons, had a 3-man crew, 14mm armour, a 2x Tyler twin 4-cylinder side-valve petrol engine and 4.303-inch Hotchkiss machine guns.
The White Russian Army is very much the Tsarist army, the old Tsarist army. It's not very well suited to using mechanization. It's an old cavalry army. They have these new weapons thrust upon them because they know they need them to defeat the Red Army's armoured cars and other things like this. So they take on these British ex-World War I tanks and they try to use them as best they can. It's not very successful because the guys just don't know how to maintain these vehicles. A lot of the British personnel are sent over there to help with training and maintenance. They are also helping manuals. So very quickly the Mark IVs, Mark Vs that they acquire break down and become basically useless. They become static pillboxes with their machine guns and their 6-pound armament. They are very quickly captured by the Red Army, who have got a few more skills in the art of mechanization. They get a few of them reworking again because they sort out the engine problems that these vehicles have had. Because again, no servicing, that means they're going to break down because these vehicles are very intensive. They'd require lots and lots of loving care poured over them. They require quite a large crew, up to 8 men in them, to man all the various machine guns, to act as a brakeman, to act as the driver and the commander of the vehicle. This is something very, very odd to the Russians. They don't quite know how to deal with it. Consequently, the Mark IVs, Mark Vs are a little bit of a waste of time because they never see any real proper action. The guns are very quickly taken off them and used on armoured trains and other bits and pieces like this.
The first tank built in Russia was a reverse-engineered version of the Renault FT-17.
At the end of the Great War, the FT-17 was seen as being one of the more revolutionary is probably the wrong word to use, but one of the more modern tanks in service, and it had by that stage adopted the classical configuration of 2 tracks, an armoured body and an armoured turret containing the armament. When you think of the British Mark IV and Mark V tanks, which were basically lozenge-shaped vehicles and which had sponsons on each side with guns in, they were quite archaic. It was realised quite early on that a tank with a rotating turret containing the gun was far more effective. So the Russians captured examples of these, and one was dismantled and evaluated, and they decided to reverse engineer it, which effectively means working out how to remanufacture all the parts themselves using local expertise, knowledge and the resources available. So this was put into production in the mid-20s. The first example, powered by a Fiat petrol engine, which were available in small quantities, received the name, it was actually given to Lenin as a present and received the name Freedom Fighter Comrade Lenin. After the reverse engineering of the FT-17, the first completely indigenous Russian design was the so-called T-14, which was, if you like, an improved version of the Renault concept. Because of the conditions in Russia, it was realised that better suspension was needed. So one of the main areas which was improved and investigated was the suspension system, and the T-14 had a far improved suspension. It was slightly better armoured and also carried an indigenously produced gun. The T-14 was introduced in the late 20s, and about 960 of them were produced, and they saw service up to about 1931, but by that stage it was realised that something more effective was needed. The initial ones hadn't been very reliable, had a lot of problems which obviously required a lot of investigation before they could be rectified. After 1931 there was a construction called the T-24, which was a slightly heavier tank, again using a lot of the technology which had been developed in building the T-18, so essentially it looked like a slightly larger version of the T-18 with the same sort of suspension system.
At this time, various Russian trade delegations went abroad to look at developments in tank technology. They subsequently bought a selection of existing foreign prototypes, which were taken back to the Soviet Union and evaluated, with the best ideas incorporated into the tank technology of the time. They also looked at the concept of licensed building of Western tanks, and one that caught their eye was the Vickers 6-ton tank, which was subsequently produced in Russia from the early 1930s under the designation of the T-26. Originally, the T-26 was equipped with twin small turrets, some with machine guns, others with a machine gun and a light tank gun. Later, it was reconfigured with just a single turret carrying a 45mm gun. These developments continued up until 1937, when production ceased.
Trade delegations visited Britain. They bought examples of Vickers tanks and the Carden Lloyd company, some of their products. They also went to America and had a lot of dealings with J. Walter Christie and some of the experimental vehicles that he was producing. The so-called M1930 Christie tank was purchased. In fact, they acquired 2 examples of that, which were exported to the Soviet Union under the disguise of tractor parts. They also looked at various other nations. They visited Czechoslovakia, which had quite a embryonic tank industry of its own, and these ideas were taken back to Russia and used in their own ideas.
Through the Vickers company, the Russians also looked at the Carden Lloyd suspension system, which was proving very effective on the new tankettes, as they were known.
Light, fast vehicles that can skim over the top of mud. They don't belly down in the mud at all. They literally can trundle along, doing about 20 miles an hour, armed with a machine gun or a light 2-pound cannon, and these things literally can scoot all over a battlefield. They are mobile machine guns, that's all. 2-man crew usually, and they prove to be very, very popular within the Russian army. They think these things are wonderful and build them by the thousands. They've got some 4,000 little tankettes by 1930 in service. They've got the T-26s and T-27s literally in the hundreds, and they really do find these little tankettes very, very useful. They are simple to maintain, they are simple to operate, they don't require too much in the way of technology. None of them are carrying radios. All communication between vehicles is by flag, by semaphore. Being in a Carden Lloyd tankette, Vickers Mark 6 or anything like that, life was not easy. Life was very, very uncomfortable. You've got a 2 to 3 man maximum crew in these little tankettes. You've got a machine gun belting forth. There is no fume extraction from the vehicle. So after a 2-second burst of your machine gun, the interior of the vehicle fills up with all the cordite. You've got the smell from the engine, the petrol and everything. You've got the oil from the engine, because again, these things weren't brilliant. You've got oil leaks, you've got fuel leaks everywhere. A vehicle that is very, very noisy. You've got a vehicle that also gets very hot because, again, there's no fume extraction from inside the vehicle. Crew comfort doesn't count in the least. You know, it is the last thing on their mind. You know, if you're lucky, you get 1 inch of foam rubber to sit on. But crew comfort, nah. That comes right down the bottom of the specification list.
Tankettes were a popular and practical solution to the requirement for mobile reconnaissance in the interwar years, but with the advent of new designed, faster, light tanks that were better armed and better protected, they became obsolete by the outbreak of World War II. The Russians had also acquired some of Christie's prototypes, such as the M1930, which featured the now famous Christie's suspension, where springs acting on swing arms allow the tank to travel at high speed both on-road and cross-country. One of Christie's other ideas had been to invent a system where the tank could interchange from driving on tracks to wheels alone. On-road, it was driven by the back wheels and the front wheels were steered by the driver. The tracks were stored on the vehicle. 5 minutes were easily fitted for off-road conditions, thus saving the wear and tear of the tracks, which was the most expensive part of the suspension.
These were taken in the early 30s and as unturreted prototypes and given turrets by the Russians and actually paraded on Red Square as the so-called BT-1. Later on, copies were produced with a single turret, the BT-2, and the BT series evolved throughout the 30s up to the BT-5 and BT-7. These were all powered by a petrol engine, basically a petrol aero engine. In the late 30s, the BT-7M was actually was the first tank to receive the V2 diesel, and this was developed in Kharkov. All these tanks were built at the Kharkov locomotive factory, and the BT-7M was the first one to receive the V2 diesel, which became the standard Russian tank engine, not just only throughout the war, but also right up to the present day in its various forms. In the late 30s, although the BT series were in service, it was realised that something heavier and better armed would be required to counteract any forthcoming threat in any future war. A prototype mock-up of a tank designated the A20 was produced, and this was accepted and a real prototype constructed. It was actually suggested that this should have 20mm armour and a 45mm gun, although it was argued that by the main designer that 30mm armour and a 76mm gun would be better. This was produced, but there was still a case for a heavier tank, and this tank still retained the somewhat archaic wheel and track feature which the BT tanks had been equipped with. So a heavier prototype, the A32, was produced, which dispensed with the wheel cum track arrangement, allowed the tank to be more heavily armed and armoured, and this evolved from the A32 to the T32 and then to the ubiquitous T34. In parallel with the development of the light and medium fast tanks, the Russians had also looked at some of the ideas which other foreign countries had been using, basically that large cruiser type tanks could be constructed fulfilling the role of a land battleship. The British had a design called the Vickers Independent, which was a 5-turreted tank, and there's still one example of that on display in the United Kingdom. The Russians looked at various ideas similar to this and produced a tank called the T-28 in the mid-30s, which was a 3-turreted tank. It had one main turret containing a 76.2mm regimental howitzer and 2 smaller turrets with machine guns. Again, in parallel with this, there was a much heavier design, the T-35, which was actually a 5-turreted behemoth, if you like, a massive machine. Contained one central turret containing a 76.2mm gun two smaller turrets with a 45mm anti-tank gun in each, and the other two small turrets armed with machine guns. As you can imagine, it had a massive crew, was extremely heavy. Despite all this, it was very thinly armoured, not very well protected, very slow and mechanically unreliable. So these machines were basically relegated to performing almost ceremonial functions during the parades on Red Square, when they would be used as propaganda machines rather than something that was actually effective militarily. Because of the mechanical difficulties of the experienced by the T-28 and T-35, other heavy tank designs were developed, and these included the so-called SMK, the Sergei Mironovich Kirov, and the T-100, which were very similar designs, also multi-turreted but using different suspension systems. These prototypes also saw service during the Finnish campaign and broke down due to mechanical difficulties, but lessons had been learned. And these were incorporated in the later heavy series tanks, the so-called KV, after Clement Voroshilov, one of Stalin's defence ministers.
Heavy tank development later included the IS, also known as the JS tanks, which destroyed Berlin. Needless to say, all this tank development was taking place with the backdrop of Europe building for war.
The invasion of Poland, 1939, starts off World War II. You've got the Russians coming in from the east, you've got the Germans coming in from the west, because you start World War II with the Germans and Russians having a pact together. They had been cooperating quite a bit because the Germans had various secret testing grounds in Russia for developing their early tanks. The country has been invaded by two major armies, one from the east, one from the west. As the Germans were to find out in 1945, you can't win a war when you've been attacked by two major armies on two separate fronts.
After a comparatively easy advance into Poland, the Russians' next invasion was viewed as an easy engagement.
The Russians, during this period, they think that the Finns are going to be an absolute walkover. They do send an awful lot of their second-line tanks to attack the Finns. Because again, the Finns was a very small, unmechanized army. It was mainly ski troops, and using caribou and reindeer to tow artillery around in the snow. It was very, very primitive army. And the Russians sent their little tankettes in, and they got the hell beaten out of them by these so-called second-class army. The Finns ran circles round them in the beginning and really gave them a bloody nose. The Russians came back and they'd lost over 500 different vehicles. They had really taken a hammering from the Finns in the first encounters. The Finns were very, very good at fire and movement. They could literally set up a trap for the Russian vehicles. The Russians would drive into it, they'd be shot to pieces and captured. The Finns then, like the Israelis, turned the vehicles on the Russians. They captured the vehicles, they repaired them, put them back into action, and then used them against their old masters. And they were very, very effective at this. They continued to do this throughout World War II. The Finnish-Russian war never really finished. It constantly kept on flaring up from time to time. And again, the Finns were very, very good. They'd come across, they'd capture 20 or 30 T-34s, heavy BA-27 armoured cars, and they would turn them back against their old owners. Basically, the Russians agreed in the end, this was stalemate. We'll leave them alone if you leave us alone. And that's exactly what they did. They had a holding action to keep the Finns out of World War II. German army, when it invades Russia in 1941 in Barbarossa, they come up against a vehicle they haven't actually seen a great deal of. That's the BT-5 and the BT-7. These are medium tanks. They're armed with a 37mm anti-tank gun. This vehicle has a tremendous turn of speed. It can leap and land without damaging the crew inside it. Suspension system was developed by an American, Christie, and this vehicle is charging along 35 miles an hour for a 15-ton tank. That's not bad at all. You've got a crew inside it of between 3 and 4 men, so going into combat these things were very, very good, but they have one big problem: no armour. They are very, very weak in the armour front. 37mm anti-tank gun in 1940 is thought to be the bee's knees. It's going to stop anything dead in its tracks until you come up against a Panzer III and a Panzer IV. Then you have a big problem because the 30mm anti-tank round bounces off the front. So the BT-7s, tankettes and everything like that the Russians have got in their arsenal at this time, they've got the T-35 still floating around, this great big land ship of a vehicle with 5 turrets on it, and they are going to stop the Panzers with this mishmash of armoured vehicles, basically all developed in the 30s, never ever improved upon. Panzer IVs in particular stop dead in their tracks all the little tankettes. Their low velocity 75mm gun is blowing these things up left, right and centre. Within a matter of a month the Russian forces have been decimated. Their tank armies have been destroyed. The Germans have captured 1.5 million men. They've captured some 8,000 artillery pieces. They've destroyed some 2,000 tanks and captured over 3,000 military vehicles. In the first month of Barbarossa, the Russian army is destroyed just about. 6 months later, by the time they're on the outskirts of Moscow and other places like that, the Russian tank army no longer exists. It has gone forever. And the Russians have to find some way of stopping the Germans. Now on their drawing board, they have an improved version of the BT-7, using exactly the same suspension system, the Christie suspension system, but this new vehicle has for the first time sloped armour on it. It's got a smallish turret which is beautifully shaped, and the vehicle is very robust, very simple to maintain, and would go on to make history, and that is the T-34. T-34 is probably the most famous tank from World War II. It's developed by the Russians with a Christie suspension. It was the first tank to have genuine sloped armour, and this made an incredible difference to the weight of armour that the tank had to carry. It arrived 1942 into Russia, and the Germans just didn't have a thing that could stop it. All the German ammunition from their Mark IIIs and IVs were just bouncing off the front and sides of the T-34. It really gave the Germans a big shock.
This tank is T-34 in Russia, or T-34 in English. It's, I think, the best tank of World War II, and thanks to such tanks, I think we became winner in World War II. It's best tank, first of all, because of safety, first point, because of its power, I mean firepower. And another point, it was good for production. All these factors quite gathered together make this tank the best. I am proud of our industry, of our scientists who developed this model, and even now I think it's possible to find in some armies our tanks, T-34. Yep.
The Russians developed these mass production facilities in places like Stalingrad, Leningrad and the Moscow. But with the Germans pushing them backwards all the time, further and deeper into Russia, they packed up a lot of these tank factories, moved them back over the Ural Mountains to a place called Tankergrad. And a huge giant city was erected by the Russians, and it produced these T-34s. Even in the battles of Stalingrad and so on, they were literally running them out of the tractor factories with the crews, still painted in red colours and things like this, and using them straight in the streets there. It was quite a very robust tank, supposedly designed to be maintained by a peasant with a hammer in the field. It's incredibly simple, very robust, and why it's still in service in some countries to this day.
This is a Russian V2 tank engine as fitted to the Russian T-34 medium tank. 500 horsepower at 1800 RPM. Runs on diesel, 12 cylinders. The bore of each cylinder is 6 inches, 150 millimetres, and the stroke 283 millimetres one side, 286.7 millimetres the other. Fitted to most Russian tanks since just before World War II in various forms. It was originally developed from an aero engine, but converted for tank use and converted to diesel from petrol combustion. Even today the Russians use a similar engine in the most up-to-date tanks, including the T-90S, which has a V12 similar to this, same bore and stroke, turbocharged and tunes to develop over 1,000 horsepower. This particular T-34-85 was built in Poland under licence after the war, basically after World War II. When the Russians stopped building T-34s themselves, they sold the production plant to Czechoslovakia and to Poland, where they continued to be produced for several years after the Russians stopped production. We think this was possibly built up to about 1955. It's certainly no younger than that. It differs very slightly from some of the Russian production in small details. The casting pattern for the turret is slightly different. Came to Duxford about 10 years ago. It had been in private hands. Several private collectors in the UK had owned T-34s, which had been bought from Polish War Reserve in the early 80s. We don't know any more about its service history. We're confident that it's never actually seen any combat. To drive, this particular vehicle is now quite happy. It's reasonably hard work. The gear change is probably the most difficult part of driving this. You do have to match the revs to the gear that you want to put it into. The clutch is very on-off. It's a 21 steel plate dry clutch, and to avoid it heating up due to friction, you have to be very sudden with it. It's either on or off, and certainly slipping the clutch is not really an option in one of these if you want it to continue to be reliable. Having mastered the gear change, it is quite pleasant to drive, and certainly in wet conditions like we've got today where the ground's very slippery, the steering can be very responsive. If somebody wanted to own one of these, they'd have to think seriously about how they were going to maintain it. And whereas minor tasks such as checking fuel, oil and water levels are fairly straightforward, anything requiring the removal of any of the armour plates, you really need fairly heavy lifting gear to do that with. The rear plate on one of these, which you have to remove if you want to take the clutch or gearbox out, weighs about half a tonne on its own. It's 47mm thick armour plate, and as I say, it weighs about half a tonne just on its own, so that is quite a heavy thing to have to lift. The engine decks themselves, 3 plates bolted together. You can either take them off individually, which you can just about do by hand with a couple of bodies working on it, or in one piece with the 3 bolted together, and that's much easier done with a crane. The radiators, you really need some sort of lifting tackle, and the engine itself weighs best part of a tonne, so that really does need some sort of lifting tackle to do that with.
The other hurdle encountered when owning your own T-34 is finding the spare parts to get it up and running.
I'm hoping that I can get all the spares for this one, but it's going to be hard. There's not much Russian stuff about, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed. I am considering, but with the internet, sort of taking a holiday in Czechoslovakia or Poland and finding some breaker's yard where they're chopping them up for £1 a piece, and I go along with my trailer and throw everything in the back and give the bloke 50p and say thank you very much, and then blag my way through customs saying that there's something to do with a big Russian tractor. I have got a big Russian tractor, and much of the parts would be much the same. It's sort of built on a tank, so if I've got pictures and a manual of me Russian tractor, they might not be too fussed about me Russian tank parts I've got on the trailer. But you don't want to get in trouble in a foreign country.
No, she ain't gonna have it.
I've seen that film Midnight Express.
Breather on the gearbox has taken a bit of a bash.
All those bits of linkage though, they'll all come up with a bit of,
yeah, those are just the gear linkages.
tickling about.
They all disappear over towards the gear tower. Fan, starter ring gear.
But before I do much, to be honest, I'll have the engine out and give it a good old clean up.
Yeah.
Get everything nice and slick again, and then wallop it back in. I won't try and start it as it is.
Looks like there's plenty of tread left on the brake bands.
Hope so. That'd be a nightmare getting them redone, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
I like them because they're robust and they're simple, and I suppose really because of the aggressiveness that you have to give them to drive, it is quite novel. Your steering, it's not kind of proportional like a British vehicle. It's half pull, half lock, all pull, just lock a track, and reversing it into a tight spot next to a building with a car the other side where you have to do a turn, you know, you'd get out with sweat running off you, and this would be like sheer terror of trying to do it without knocking a building down. And because it's so noisy, you end up with this great big crowd round you, all going, yeah, bit left, bit right, you know, and in the end you have to tell them all to clear off apart from one, because they're all giving you directions, and you try to take notice of them all, and you know they're all contradicting each other, and you're going to put it through the side of a building. Lots of fun, lots of smoke, lots of noise. What do you reckon that would have been? Something's been chopped off there.
You have a little bent up bracket. There's one either side.
Wing mirrors.
Nope, better than that. There's a board that goes across.
Ah, I remember.
Stops the bow wave breaking into the driver's hatch when he goes through ponds and rivers.
I remember. My other one did have that. Power-wise, they seem immense. I've pulled Abbott self-propelled guns around, and you don't even know they're on the back. The other good thing is the starting. You can either do it on. You've got the extra added feature of an air start. On the T-34s, you had to replenish your air cylinders, and I think there's 8 starts per cylinder when they're up to full pressure. So you can leave the tank years. The batteries are absolutely covered, but you can fire it over on air, and she'll just rattle up. Very, very good at pull starting as well. If you give it a yank and let the clutch up, it only takes you 10 feet to start it, and the old girl will burst into life. They reckon there was a little bit of a danger if you left one in gear and someone came into the sort of tank park a little bit recklessly and hit it with another tank. The knock could be enough to turn the engine over and make it fire up, and if the hand throttle was on, it would just go chugging off on its own. Just that impact was enough to knock the engine over hard enough to start one.
Back on the German-Russian frontier, Operation Barbarossa, which Hitler anticipated would only take a couple of months to complete, was grinding to a halt.
The Russians stopped the German Panzer Division advance by using the Russian winter. They just kept on withdrawing back into their motherland. This is the killer. From Napoleon's time to modern times, the Russian winter has stopped invading armies. And this is what the Russians knew was the Achilles of the German army. Out of Manchuria and other places like that came the Mongol army. Now, the Mongol army had been equipped with the new T-34 tank, and this was set against the German Panzer divisions outside of Moscow. And it came as one heck of a shock to the Germans. Their 50mm anti-tank weapons, the new tank guns that the Panzer III and Panzer IV had been equipped with, suddenly started bouncing off this tank. They couldn't kill it. And this was a big fright. You know, how do you stop a tank you can't kill? So they're now having to use 2 or 3 Panzers to destroy one T-34. Fortunately, they didn't appear in great numbers initially, but they soon did. And the Germans very quickly had to develop bigger and better anti-tank guns. The Mongol armies, they produced amazing results. They stopped the Blitzkrieg operation in its tracks. They give the Russians time to rebuild, to reform their armies, their tank armies in particular, that would then become a major part of World War II.
Сталин сказал: больше оружия, больше танков. Московские патриоты рапортуют: на Энском заводе уже налажен ремонт боевых машин. Специалисты принимают машины из заводских цехов прямо на фронт.
With the factories producing such high volume of tanks at this time, the German offensive in the east was soon to receive the shock of its life. The Battle of Kursk was the focal point of the German Operation Zitadal, which proved to be their last great offensive in the east in the summer of 1943. It was important to the Germans to regain the initiative in the east after the crushing defeat of Stalingrad. Indeed, Hitler stated its success would shine forth like a beacon, a signal to all those that doubted a German victory in the war. The invasion was originally planned for the spring, but Hitler had insisted upon waiting for their super weapons to come online, which included the Ferdinand SPG, the Panther, and most importantly, 57 Tiger tanks.
Танковых и моторизованных дивизий, значительной силы авиации. Особые надежды враг возлагал на новые мощные танки «Тигр» и самоходные орудия «Фердинанд».
The Germans are waiting for these new vehicles, in particular the Tiger, to act as a breakthrough weapon, to smash the anti-tank defences of the Russian T-34 tank. Nothing could stand in the way of the Tiger, or that's what the Germans felt, and they were going to use this to batter their way through.
To any military strategist, the Kursk Arch was the focal point.
It was the arch which appeared as the lines of German troops, and of course it was quite clear that it's necessary to eliminate this. And that's why Zhukov, he expected that offensive operation from German side will be on Kursk Arch.
The dilemma the Soviet High Command faced was what action they should take.
It was difficult for our general staff, Zhukov and of course Stalin, because if we make comparison between German troops at that time and Russian troops, we had more powerful troops at the time. We had more tanks, we had more guns and so on and so on. At the same time, Germans, they have powerful tanks too, the so-called Tiger. They had more powerful gun. So it was decided that should be two parts of operation in Kursk Arch. First, defensive operation, and second, offensive operation.
Советское командование своевременно разгадало замысел врага. В соответствии с планом Верховного Главнокомандования было решено в оборонительном сражении измотать и обескровить врага, а затем перейти к решительному наступлению и разгромить всю вражескую группировку.
With Hitler delaying the offensive until the summer, the Soviets had the time to build a defense network on a scale never seen before. The military and 300,000 local civilians laid over 400,000 mines, dug 5,000 kilometers of trenches. They were aware of the timing of the offensive through their Lucy spy network in Germany and from the British Enigma decryption of the ultra codes. A captured sapper in the north and a deserter in the south determined the exact time, 3:30 a.m.
Kursk battle began on the 5th of July with a preliminary counter-attack using with all our guns. As a result, launch of operation from German side was postponed for maybe 1 hour.
German prisoners taken during the battle said that artillery especially had suffered, and almost all communications, observation and command and control systems were destroyed by this preemptive strike. The subsequent non-synchronous German offensive bore witness to this.
So you've got two major German tank armies, one in the north, one in the south of the Bulge. The idea is they will charge into the sides of the Bulge, meet in the middle and capture and encircle a major part of the Russian tank army. They were hoping to capture 1.5 million men, plus a load of artillery, and destroy a bucket load of Russian tanks. doesn't quite go to depth, because what the Russians do is they develop the hedgehog system. And the hedgehog system is a all-round fortified area. It's got anti-tank ditches in front of it, it's got anti-tank guns behind it, and literally they just let the Germans drive through. These various fortified hedgehogs then have interlinking fields of fire, and the anti-tank guns are taking out various German tanks from the side, from the back, from the front. They don't know where all this fire is coming from, and it grinds the German army down as they have to fight from one hedgehog to another hedgehog to another hedgehog, and they're only advancing 6 miles a day at times, and they very quickly are brought to a grinding halt by this integrated defense system that the Russians have developed.
Of course, German headquarters, they had information about our defensive operation, but they failed to locate 10 tanks army deep in our defense region. That tanks army, they played great role in Kursk battle.
Героические труженики советского тыла бесперебойно снабжали фронт мощной новейшей боевой техникой.
In 1940, the USSR had 115 tanks. By the summer of 1942, they had 12,500. The Germans' 9th Army in the north was soon ground down by General Rokorovsky's forces. By the 12th of July, the Soviets were able to go on the offensive and gain grounds towards Oriel. At the same time in the south, the Wehrmacht fared better and were ready to spearhead through the Russian lines near the village of Prokhorovka. They were somewhat surprised when they were met by the 5th Guards tank armies, a huge mechanized reserve with the sole interest of smashing the German Panzer Corps to pieces. Prokhorovka soon became the epicenter of the Kursk battle and would go down in history as the largest tank engagement ever mounted.
At Kursk, you end up with some 800 tanks meeting in an area the size of a reasonable airfield, literally about 3 miles wide, a couple of miles deep. And these tanks are so close, they're having to ram each other. It's every man for himself and woman, because the Russian forces are all fully integrated. It is absolute mayhem. There is horrendous rain overhead. It's a full-blown thunderstorm at times. Very little air cover is supplied, and what air cover there is being shot down by the Russian Air Force. The fighting starts very early in the morning and continues until well after dark. By that time, the Germans have lost some 1,400 vehicles. The Russians have lost over 2,000 tanks, have been destroyed in this almost hand-to-hand tank warfare.
Due to the superiority of the Tiger tank's 88mm cannon that could easily pick off T-34s at a range of 2,000 meters, the Russian tanks had to get up close and personal to stand a chance of taking one out. On average, it took 4 T-34s to kill one Tiger.
It was absolute and utter carnage, and it becomes the largest tank battle in history, even to this day. The Russian Air Force the next day comes along and they finish off what's left of the German panzers. The Germans then have to do a fighting withdrawal, which takes them about 2 weeks, where they're constantly harried by the Russian Air Force and what's left of the Guards tank army.
Таяла мощь врага, таяла его техника и живая сила.
Eventually, the front settles down. The Russians have taken the Bulge, plus a huge area in front of their lines. At the end of the day, the German panzer divisions, the Panzer Corps, Panzer Army is destroyed. Never again will the Germans be able to mount huge tank attacks like they have done at Kursk. They will never again have this number of tanks and trained crews available to really smash into the Russian armies again. or later on in 1944 into the Allies in Northern Europe.
It was a fierce battle. I'm proud of our Russians. I admire Germans, tanks, Germans fighters, because it was, I think, World War II was the honest war in this world. And Kursk battle was one of the honest battles of that time.
Коммунисты и комсомольцы личным примером увлекали за собой бойцов. Ломая яростное сопротивление гитлеровцев, наши войска ворвались вглубь вражеской обороны. Для решительной борьбы с врагом до окончательной победы.
August the 5th. Oriol is free. Victory. The Gestapo's prisoners were saved. The same hour, a swastika was trampled in liberated Belgrade. The red flag was again hoisted over Oriol, once and for all. General Gorbatov turns over the prerogatives of power to the civilian administration. Frontline reports of the Soviet Information Bureau mentioned more and more names of liberated localities. Peace and motherhood re-emerged from oblivion. The march, started in the Ark of Kursk, ended on the Oder. The heroes of the Ark of Kursk, who covered the path from the Volga to the Oder, live on and will always be with us.
The T-34, initially it was armed with a 76.2, basically 3-inch gun, although by the end of 1943 it was realised that this was inadequate against the new German tanks which were being introduced. So studies were undertaken to improve the armament in the gun and at the same time increase the turret size, allowing the turret crew to be increased from 2 to 3. So in early 1944, T-34-85 was introduced, which had a 3-man turret crew, still 2 crew in the hull, and was equipped with an 85mm tank gun. This still had a top speed of over 30 kilometers an hour. It also allowed the commander to act and work far more effectively in the turret because he was given the job purely of commanding, whereas in the T-34-76 he also had to double as loader as well.
Now you can see that this turret was made by welding. It was quite innovative, especially at that time. It was World War II, and in the Urals it was a kind of invention. But this process of welding gave 2 factors: safety and fast productivity. And another point, we could at that time make a lot of tanks.
Т-34 сражались во всех великих битвах войны. 34-ка будет признана лучшим танком Второй мировой.
This is a T-34 Now to load the 85mm ammunition, the loader would take the round out of the racks in the turret. He would put the round straight inside the breech. The breech is an automatic breech, so it would slam up behind the round. The loader would then press his safety button, which is to the right-hand side of the breech itself. Now that's there so that the gunner doesn't fire a bit prematurely and damage him whilst the gun's recoiling. Once he's pressed that, the gunner would then turn his switch on. There's two switches to the left of the gun. One is for the main gun and one is for the machine gun. And once those are turned on, he can then fire from the trigger, which is on the knob that elevates the gun up and down. And from that point he can fire. The blank load we're using today is basically just straight gunpowder. Now what I've done, I've got an original case, and we've taken out the existing primer from the bottom of the case, converted it to take a blank 12-bore cartridge. And then from there we put in just under 1 kilo of black powder and some wadding, and then put it in the breech, and the rest is exactly as it would have been in World War II.
To experience the T-34 up close, along with the world's largest collection of military vehicles, you have to visit Beltring in Kent, England, in July for the War and Peace show.
This one was made in 1944, and she saw service towards the end. We think probably made in about November 44. At some point in time, it was readjusted for sort of modern stuff within the Russian army, had different wheels, etc. put on it, and ended up in Yugoslavia. And by the time the Croatian and Bosnian punch-up was in the 90s, it ended up on the side of the Croatians. The writing on the side actually says, "Respected leader Stalin," literally translated into English. We found that writing underneath the paint when we restored it. Well, I haven't physically had to do too much to it. We've been right through the engine and checked all the levels, changed all the fluids, etc., etc. Outside-wise, the track guards were pretty ropey. A lot of the toolboxes and bits and pieces were missing, which I've had to find. And the gun had been laid up. The electrics to fire the gun were all, not working, so I've had to rebuild all that. So by and large, a lot of it was cosmetic. The T-34-85 continued in service with the Red Army until shortly after the Second World War. It was exported widely. It was produced under licence in Czechoslovakia and also in Poland. Exported to a lot of the Middle Eastern countries, to African states, and used in the reserves of a lot of the Warsaw Pact countries. Last saw service, as far as we know, in the Balkan Wars in the early 90s.
It's a 1945 T-34-85, believed to serve in the final push for Berlin. The crews would often paint slogans on the side of the turrets. this one, which has been translated to Berlin or to Berlin, and you wouldn't really written that on the tank unless you were intending to go there. In 1964, it was refurbished by the Czech Army and put into their storage, hence the later edition light guards that obviously a lot of Czech and post-war T-34s are fitted with. And this got them fitted purely because it was refurbished by them. It's well documented being one of the hardest tanks to drive. Unlike a lot of the British and American tanks that had automatic gearboxes or you had power-assisted steering, this thing is all brute force and ignorance. You sit right at the front, the gearbox is right at the back. It's all done with levers and linkages that run under the floor. You know, you really want 2 hands on each tiller to turn and another 2 for the gear stick. It's powered by a 5-speed crash gearbox. There's no synchro mesh. It's just hard work, you know. To the left of the driver, right where there's a nice comfy space to leave your elbow, is a preheater. So once it's been running for a while, the water pump through, that just gets nice and hot. So you can scald your arm on that, amongst banging your head on everything else that's in there. It's just hard work, but it's good fun. It wasn't made for, you know, for ease.
It is hard to drive, but you get used to it after a while. So that's it.
Patience is a virtue.
Yeah, and you need a to go with it. Bought it in 2000. Been sitting for 10 years, and as soon as we started it and started using it, the clutch bearing went on it. So Peter fixed the clutch for me 2 years ago. I painted it this year, shot blasted it and painted it and everything, and here it is. He's top fitter.
It's a T-34.
It's hot and hard work.
And the bad side, it's a T-34. It's a splendid machine, absolutely excellent, but just steering's a bit on the heavy side today.
Bit of dust?
Bit of dust, a little bit of dust. You got the dust there, Clive?
T-34, the ultimate big boy's toy. Heavy tanks had also been an important factor in the downfall of the Wehrmacht. Tank designers had learnt their lessons at the beginning of the war with the T-35, the SMK and the T-100. Subsequently, they drew up the KV-1, which played a huge role at the Battle of Kursk and the ensuing destruction of Berlin.
The later heavy series tanks, the so-called KV, after Klement Voroshilov, one of Stalin's defence ministers. These were actually just single turret tanks, but weighed in at over 40 tons, which was considerably heavier than the contemporary T-34s. They were powered by more or less the same engine, again a V12 diesel, slightly more powerful than that fitted to the T-34, but the machine would actually be able to travel slightly more slowly. And in addition to that, the tank was armed with the same 76.2mm gun as the T-34-76. So the only real advantage was better protection and the ability to carry more rounds of ammunition.
Production of the KV-1 began in 1940 at the Kurovsky works in Leningrad. After the Russian implosion following Operation Barbarossa, the motherland realised that they needed to start what became known as total war. This meant that a large number of the factory workers were women, who also went out to the front as mechanics and drivers.
The Russian army becomes the first fully integrated armed force in the world. Women would serve in tank crews, artillery batteries. They would operate as snipers. Some very famous ladies during the Stalingrad and Leningrad sieges became snipers. You've got women pilots, and the women do become a serious problem for the German army and literally start to slaughter the Russian population, man, woman and child, to make themselves safe.
Painted with whitewash to merge into the winter landscape, this KV-1 bears the patriotic slogan, "From the women of Leningrad to the front." With the German forces pushing further east, tank production was moved over the Ural Mountains to Chelyabinsk, which later became known as Tankograd, the city of tanks. The KV borrowed many of the design specifications of the SMK tank, including the armour scheme, design of optical sights, elements of the transmission, and so on. By June 1941, the Red Army possessed 693 KV tanks.
Лейтенанты братья Гудс, как всегда, первыми ведут свои танки в бой.
The heavy armour of the KV had the reputation of being invulnerable. This is corroborated by several accounts of solitary KVs that held up entire German units for a significant period of time. The chief deficiencies of the KV tank were its weak mechanical reliability, poor crew ergonomics, and limited means of observation. The greatest problem, however, was poor training among the crews. Its service consisted of supporting medium and light tanks. To do this more effectively, another type of heavy tank, first called the KV with a large turret, was created. Later it was designated the KV-2, which was designed to bring down anti-tank defences. The gun barrel was 3,700 millimetres long and weighed 1.36 tonnes in itself. The KV-2 was actually a self-propelled artillery gun with a turning turret. From this beast, explosive shells weighing 51 kilos were fired to a distance of 5,000 metres.
The heavy series tanks, the so-called KV, these stayed in service right up until the end of the war, although from 1944 onwards the other heavy tank series, the so-called Joseph Stalin or IS series, was introduced, and evolution from the KV series, the first tank to be fitted with a 122mm gun. Concurrent with these designs, self-propelled gun variants were built on these chassis. These enabled guns of a larger calibre to be carried for special purposes such as anti-tank defence, demolition of enemy bunkers and strong points. At the Battle of Kursk, the 152mm self-propelled gun built on the KV chassis was used extensively for demolishing tanks. After 1943, the same howitzer was mounted on the IS series as the ISU 152, and later after the war 152M. And these were used extensively right up until the end of the war and in service afterwards.
The IS tanks, named after their leader Iosif Stalin, are better known in the West as the JS series, for Joseph Stalin.
JS2, that vehicle is an incredible monster. It's basic anti-tank gun proof. It's got 120mm of frontal armour, some 6 inches thick, and it's designed literally to break through the German anti-tank line. And the big problem was, though, that they discovered very quickly that the drivers would panic with all these shells bouncing off the front of the vehicle and would abandon their post by leaping out through their driver's hatch. So to overcome this, the Russians decided they would weld the hatch shut. So that the only way in for the driver is down through the fighting compartment, and the only way back out is up through the fighting compartment again, where you've got to pass the rest of your mates, and of course the tank commander, who's then got a chance to stop you, kick you back into your seat, and you've then got to drive the vehicle forward with all this lot whizzing around your ears. The tank JS2 was proof against the 88mm anti-tank gun up to about 500 meters, so it's getting very, very close. With its 122mm gun, of course, it stands a very good chance of destroying the anti-tank weapon long before it's going to suffer any permanent damage. So the main thing was to keep the driver in his place. He had to stay in his seat, he had to continue, or her, continue driving the vehicle forward into the German lines. So they then break the German anti-tank line and the infantry and everything. The T-34s then come swarming up like a flock of bees, and they pile into this breach in the German lines, and then very quickly fan out to either side of the breach and into the German rear area, destroying what's left of the German armies. As after Kursk, basically it became a withdrawal all the way back to Berlin for the German panzer armies. They no longer had the vehicles to cope with the Russian mass numbers. They were coming up against 100 German tanks against 1,000 Russian tanks. That's why you get some of the famous tank Stuka aces with some 300 odd tank kills to their credit, because they just couldn't miss. These things were literally lined up track to track all the way from one side of Russia to the other, and Zhukov just pushed his armies forward and forward. The Russians, on arrival in Berlin, they've lost 1.5 million men getting there. It's in the fighting for the outside of Berlin. The tanks themselves, the small ones, the T-34s, etc., become almost useless in the street fighting. What they rely on is the Joseph Stalin tanks, in particular the Joseph Stalin II with its 122mm gun, and the Joseph Stalin self-propelled gun, the 152mm weapon. And these two vehicles in particular are used in great numbers, and they literally go from building to building, destroying any form of German resistance. They also bring in large amounts of artillery, the god of war, as the Russians refer to it. They bring in the Katushka rocket launcher systems, and they are bombarding everywhere. In the victory parades that were held in Berlin, one new tank came, and that was Joseph Stalin III. Beautifully sculptured turrets, rounded turret, long 120mm gun overhanging the front of the vehicle, an impressive tank, something that would knock the spots off any Allied tank. It was an incredible ballistically shaped tank. Any anti-tank rounds would bounce off the turret. It was so well shaped. Huge overhanging gun, and again frontal armour 6 inches or more, and it was an incredible vehicle and frightened the life out of NATO as it became after the war. The Allies had nothing that could touch this vehicle.
Heavy tank development continued from the IS-2 series through to the IS-3. This tank evolved into the so-called T-10, which was very similar in configuration, with a centrally mounted, centrally positioned driver's hatch, a pointed, ballistically effective armoured hull, and a very flat, round, domed turret. The T-10 was essentially an IS-3, but modified. It was longer, it had one more wheel station, and it mounted an even heavier gun. IS-4 was in service certainly for some time. All these were massive tanks mounted ever larger guns using ever larger engines. By the time they got to the IS-7 they were actually using a marine diesel engine rather than the ubiquitous V12 diesel which most other Russian tanks were using. But in the late 50s Khrushchev decreed that the heavy tank series would be terminated as he didn't see that there was a need for that on the modern battlefield. So he cancelled the heavy tank development projects and basically at the end of the line stopped there. In parallel with heavy tank development after the war, medium tanks continued to be developed extensively, and these all really led on from the highly successful T-34 design. So from T-34-85 there was a natural progression through T-44, which used a lot of the lessons which had been learnt during the war with the T-34. So the armour layout was changed. It was sloped at the front, but slab-sided and almost vertical armour at the back. This didn't offer any better protection, but it was just decided that the design would be better, and the number of hits taken on the sides of the tank was so small as to negate any advantage in producing the tanks with sloped side armour.
Современной войны армия учится в обстановке, приближенной к боевой.
The T-44 evolved into the T-54, which entered service in the late 1940s and early 50s.
The T-54 came about pretty much by having a bigger turret on what was basically the T-44 hull. The main changes of the T-54 over the T-44 prototype were an improved engine, the V54 engine, and the steering was improved to a two-stage reduction box, which much improved the steering over the T-34s. First prototype T-54 was completed in 1945. Approved for service in 1946 and entered production in Nizhny Tagil in 1947 and went also in Kharkov in 1948. The early T-54 failed to live up to expectations, and its production during these years was curtailed, with the T-34-85 accounting for about 88% of production through to 1950. One of the major drawbacks of the new gun was the ammunition was so large it reduced the number of rounds that could be carried in the tank to 34 compared to about 60 in the T-34-85. While the early turret design was not very successful, the Soviets had some success with the IS-3 heavy tank, which had a hemispherical shape, which didn't have shot traps under the front, which would have trapped incoming rounds, caused the turret to be blown off very easily. In contrast, the T-54 turret had a wide and vulnerable gun mantlet and pronounced shot traps on either side of the turret front. The T-54, when it was fitted with the snorkeling equipment, was able to wade through rivers for a depth of 5 metres. The most obvious way of identifying a T-54 from a T-55 is on the top of the turret there's a mushroom vent, which the T-55 hasn't got.
T-54. It's very, very simple. And the Russian idea is pure and utter simplicity. A very basic, rugged engine, a very simple chassis, again designed around the T-34 chassis, a very good, reliable gun. They developed various different types of ammunition, some of it rocket-propelled ammunition.
The T-54 was also used in nuclear weapons trials, where it endured a 2 to 15 kiloton charge, a range of over 300 metres. Crew survival, however, required at least 700 metres from the epicentre. Following such trials, it was decided to create an NBC, nuclear, biological and chemical protection system, which would kick in 0.3 seconds after detecting gamma radiation.
It sees service in the jungles of Vietnam. in Korea. It's a wonderful basic tank. Vietnam was not a tank environment, but again the T-54 was used quite effectively by the North Vietnamese army against the Americans. They brought them through the jungle, something that everybody said was impossible. But they came down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, and all of a sudden we got T-54 tanks running around the streets of Saigon. Yep. And the Americans are wondering, where the hell are these all come from?
Сегодня наша армия сильна как никогда, и наследники славы героев готовы всегда дать отпор агрессору.
Afghanistan in particular, the T-54 are taken there in large numbers, but very quickly they prove to be a liability. Main reason is the gun can't be elevated very particularly well. It doesn't get the height, so it can't pick off the Mujahideen from the hills. So what they do is they bring the T-34 back. Because the T-34 main weapon could be elevated higher than T-54, it was far more useful in small wars like the Afghan. But Afghanistan became very much the Vietnam of the Russian army. It was something that should never have been contemplated for armoured warfare. The tank, as it's trundling through these areas, becomes a sitting duck. And the Mujahideen were excellent at make, do, amend, and they would capture a number of RPG-7 Russian anti-tank launchers and turn them against the Russians themselves. They were destroying the vehicles. Even a half pint of petrol in a milk bottle with a bit of rag dropped on the engine deck of the T-54 could terminate that vehicle. It's not good tank country, and the Russians very quickly discovered this. T-54. It sees service to this day with armies like the Syrians. The Iraqi army still had a number of T-54s in service. To this day it can be found in about 20 armies around the world.
T-54s, T-55s, they're very, very similar. You know, if you know what you're looking at, there's only a few distinguishing marks for the fuel tanks at the front, the air intakes at the back that were changed for modifications. The wheel setup and torsion bar suspension is the American Christie's type. Again, extremely reliable. But T-54s, T-55s, if you just glance at them, you won't tell them apart. The T-54 did have a hull-mounted machine gun, 792 machine gun, that was still carried on onto the T-55s. But after the first few hundred were produced, they decided to stop the idea as the driver's got enough to do in the tank anyway, because all the controls in T-55 are all manual. There's no power assistance, hydraulics, nothing. It's physical strength. Someone who's isn't strong couldn't drive one. The clutch is an absolute nightmare. You know, it's almost 2 feet to push it down. You can't ride the clutch at all. You must take your foot straight off the clutch, otherwise you'll burn the engine clutches out, the metal on metal clutches. There's lots of things about the tank that is reliable if you know how to use it, but if you don't know how to use it, you will break it. But if you use it properly, they're good tanks.
Another Russian tank descended almost directly from the T-34 series via several other intermediate tanks. The immediate successor to the T-54 carries a 100mm cannon as used in the Su-100, the D-10, which was originally a piece of naval artillery. Big V12 39-litre diesel. Not supercharged, naturally aspirated. Fuel consumption, well, we don't worry about that. It's not us paying for the diesel. Weighs about 39-40 tons, much used throughout the Soviet Union and also other Warsaw Pact countries. Currently in service in Afghanistan, in several Central African countries, and also used by some of the rebels in Chechnya. We don't know the history of this, unfortunately. It was built under licence in Czechoslovakia, probably in the late 60s, early 70s. It's in fairly immaculate condition. It's never been used in anger, and it drives extremely nicely.
Generally, T-55s are a very cheap, economical tank. Most countries in the world can afford them. Most countries can develop them and use them. They're really designed from Second World War tanks, so even a farmer could actually service and maintain and repair. There's nothing really difficult on the tank. The biggest problems really you face is weight, and I'm sure you'll come across the weight problem of everything you take off. It's just so heavy and so cumbersome and awkward. You need exceptionally sized tools, special tools in some cases, but generally you can pretty much maintain it without too much cost. The T-55s aren't very well armoured, they're not very well gunned, but they're a competent tank for these third world countries who don't need main battle tanks. They're not heavy tanks, they're a medium tank. And really, that's what you've got to rely on. It's a medium tank. It's not a battle tank. It's not meant to stand there and go toe-to-toe with anything. Good infantry support, and it just gives everyone confidence when you've got tanks around. I mean, my particular tank was captured by the Israelis in the 1968. The Israelis captured about 1,100 of them. Did loads of modifications to use them themselves, and they had 5 brigades of tanks, about 600 tanks in all. That were modified to the M68L 705mm gun, gun stabilisation, which is standard on some of the models, and various other control systems in the tank to make it better. A few external modifications to identify them to their own troops. But generally they were pretty much standard T-55s used by the Israelis, and you know, they were a prize of war and they used them to the best of their ability. There's not a lot of room in Russian tanks. They're very tight. Most Russians are actually around 5 foot tall to operate in their tanks, as they're wanting to keep a very low silhouette. And the taller the people, obviously, the taller the tank needs to be. Myself, I could do with a bigger hatch in the tank actually, but I managed to fit in and drive it. It is very, very awkward, very hard, but you know, I get in there. How do you start a tank? Well, the Russian tanks are fitted with 2 systems. The main system is pneumatic, compressed air. There's a compressed air starter motor on the engine. This is the primary system, and it has a battery backup, so you can start the engine off a conventional starter motor. The air system, actually, when you use the air system to start the tank, it builds up the oil pressure in the engine, so that when the engine starts, the oil pressure is already up to 40 pounds per square inch. There is a preheater in the tank, so you can actually heat the water system of the tank to about 50 degrees centigrade before you start the engine. This is very useful in very cold places, you know, Russia, I mean, Siberia, there's some seriously cold places in Russia. The Germans were defeated by half by the cold, and the Russian tanks are very competent in cold weather. Russian tanks can start at minus 40 to plus 40. It really doesn't matter about temperature with Russian tanks. They all smoke like, well, terrible. I mean, they're not very environment friendly. But it's for expansion and contraction of the engine. They can run anywhere, in any climate, and the simplest of people can maintain a T-55. A pair of mole grips and a screwdriver, you can pretty much do anything on it. To get the tank into motion, is a pretty simple process. It's got conventional 3 pedals as any normal family saloon car, a clutch, a brake and an accelerator. The throttle is somewhat different. On a T55, when you start the engine, there is no automatic tick over. If you start a car, you'll start it and you can allow the engine to tick over straight away. A Russian tank's different. The way you start the engine, you start it with your foot on the accelerator. Once it's started, you have to set the tick over manually with a hand throttle. This hand throttle is what actually sets your tick over. When you start it up from cold, you set the tick over to about 800. Once the engine's warmed up, you can drop it down to about 600 RPM. This is also the same thing that turns the engine off. Russian tanks don't have a solenoid on the diesel pump, which allows fuel through and stops fuel electrically. A Russian tank has a throttle that goes from 0 to 100%. So if you take the hand throttle off to 0, it doesn't allow any fuel through. That stops the engine. It's so simplified that nothing really can go wrong with that system. There is one Achilles heel with Russian tanks. They have a metal on metal clutch. If you try and ride the clutch on these Russian tanks, you'll burn them out straight away. The clutches, as soon as they start slipping, they get heat in them and they distort, and once it's distorted, it's all over for the clutch. The tank's going nowhere, and you've got a fair few hours of very difficult, very heavy work changing the clutch. Once you actually take your foot off the clutch and the tank starts moving, it's pretty much like any conventional car. You can first, second, third, fourth and fifth. It's a difficult tank to drive, but it's reliable. I mean, this year so far with this tank, we've probably covered 150 miles on public roads. It seems to be very reliable. The fuel consumption's nothing to shout about. It does about a gallon to the mile. So, you know, it's just one of those things. If you want to use a tank on the road, you've got to pay for it. First real combat that I can recall is pretty much Iran-Iraq T-54s. That's where it all started off, T-54s. T-55s did come out later, and obviously when the Iraqis and the Iranians were fighting, the Russians were making lots and lots of money supplying both sides. But I mean, in combat, they're pretty much combat proven. The later ones have got night vision, infrared. But once they come up against tanks that are superior, like the Challenger tanks and the American Abrams, they've got no hope. You know, they might as well just park the tank up and run away. Afghanistan, the Russians lost loads in Afghanistan to ambushes, Taliban, and it's not a tank that is very well armour protected. A lot of the rocket propelled grenades, the RPGs, are very effective against them, and it's quite easy to immobilise them. Once it's immobilised, you're in big trouble. take the first tank, take the last tank in a convoy, and then basically just pick the rest off as and when. And in the valleys of Afghanistan, they just work to it. You're better off with helicopter gunships. It's really a credit to the Russian designers that they're still used so long after they were designed, and I think I'm quite safe in saying a T-55 must be the longest ever frontline service tank ever, and to be quite honest, I could see the T-55 being around for the next 20 years at least. In many countries you probably find 30 or 40. I mean, it's only a few years since Bosnia, and the amount of World War II armour that's coming out of Bosnia that the Yugoslavians and the Serbs used, Hellcats and similar tanks and T-55s, I can see T-55s being around pretty much forever, really, as long as we need tanks or we destroy ourselves, one way or another.
Another development from the T-55 series was the T-62. The T-62 again entered service in the mid-60s. It was effectively a stretched version of the T-55, mounted 115mm smoothbore cannon, which allowed it to fire a wide variety of projectiles. These again saw service in more or less the same theatres as the T-55. They were exported widely to the Middle East, to Egypt, to Syria, also used in Afghanistan, also supplied to Pakistan, and again certainly with all the Russian satellite states.
T-62s were just an interim problem fix, really, with slightly bigger 115mm gun, very similar tank in every aspect. The way you tell T-55s, T-62s, easiest way is the wheel setup, where T-55s have got a space between the first and second road wheel. The T-62 has got the space between the last and the fourth road wheel. The tanks are actually slightly longer and slightly wider. There are not many produced, really, T-62s in comparison with 55s. There was an interim tank while they were developing the T-72.
This particular example was donated to the museum via the British Army, where it had been evaluated for a number of years. So it's had a number of in-service modifications. You can probably see the track guards. One of them on the left-hand side is original. The one on the right-hand side has been fabricated from sheet metal. It's had quite a long and checkered service history, so it's rather sad and old. But with a bit of love and attention and a bit more work, it will run again. This particular example is also fitted with a KMT6 mine plough, which you can see behind me, rather than some of the earlier mine roller systems. The gun is able to achieve its maximum elevation, obviously with the breech depressing within the turret. However, the maximum depression of the gun is governed by how high the turret roof is. Because of this, the gun is mounted quite low down, so the tank can achieve the gun depression that it needs. But in so doing, it still maintains a very low silhouette. And this is a feature of Russian tanks compared with some of their Western contemporaries. Some of the Western equipment in service at the same time actually was quite tall and was easily seen on the horizon compared with some of the Russian tanks, which were extremely low and had a very low silhouette. In the late 60s, it was decided that a new tank was required to replace the ageing T-62s and T-55 series tanks. So modern designs were investigated, and basically two different designs were put into production. The T-64, which was produced in Kharkov in the Ukraine, and the T-72, which was produced in Russia at the tank plant in Nizhny Tagil. Both tanks were very similar in shape, in function, had minor differences. The main one was the suspension, where the T-64 had smaller road wheels and the T-72 had larger road wheels. In addition, the engines were different. The 72 continued to use the same Russian V12 tank diesel as used in many of its predecessors, whereas with the 64 a new tank diesel engine was developed, which was much flatter, which allowed the whole silhouette of the tank to be reduced by making the back of the tank lower. These entered production simultaneously, although the T-64 was actually found to be expensive to produce, and the new engine had teething problems, mechanical difficulties, because it was a new system which had yet to be proved. Whereas, of course, the T-72's engine was using proven technology and had relatively few problems in comparison. T-64 was used only by Russian forces or Soviet forces, whereas the T-72 continued to be used by other countries and was produced under license in Poland and Czechoslovakia.
Now, the T-64 came as one heck of a shock to the Russian army. They didn't really want it because it was not a natural progression from the T-55 to the 62 and then upwards. It was a complete new beast. Their conscript army was a short-term army. It was designed only for a couple of years. These guys had to be trained quickly and they had to operate simple equipment. The T-64 was not simple. Also, the first T-64s that came out were absolute dogs. They constantly had mechanical breakdown, failures in the 115mm gun, their gun sighting and other bits and pieces were absolutely hopeless. And the T-64 developed a horrendous reputation within the Soviet army. But it was pushed forward and the Russian army was told, forget it, this is the new way ahead. T-64 is developed over a period of time and initially starts off with a 115mm gun, 3-man crew, auto-loader, which is not at all reliable, and given half a chance will feed the gunner or the tank commander into the breach as well as a shell. It's a real beast of a tank, it really is. 1972, further development goes along and the T-64 is gently improving, but the main improvements come in 1980 when the gun is swapped over to the 125mm gun, a new engine is put into the vehicle, and the T-64 comes of age at long last. But during this time, two other tank factories, the Leningrad tank factory and the heavy tank factory, had also got involved in the story of the T-64. The heavy tank factory acquires 4 T-64s. And they put some of the developments that they'd put into the T-62 onto the T-64. They'd put in a 125mm gun, a brand new autoloader that had been developed for the T-62 was put into the T-64. But then they looked at the track, the transmission, the running gear, and those pieces on the T-64 and decided it was all rubbish and would scrap it all. And they produced new running gear, a new engine, and new track and everything for the T-64. This new T-64 was shown in 1972 to the Russian Tank Bureau. They quite liked it, but were absolutely furious with the heavy tank guys for going off on their own. They had no instructions to develop this new tank. They had broken all the rules of the Soviet bureaucracy by doing this. This was internal politics at its best. And they thought they had got a winning tank, and they called it the T-72. T-72 comes along. It's a minimalist tank. It's designed for export. It's cheap, $1.2 million for a fully kitted out T-72, which is very, very good money. T-64 is nearly $2 million. So big price discrepancy already between those two vehicles.
T-72, which has been sold around the world. Very, very effective three-man tank. Very light. It's basically a sports car of the battlefield. Automatic loader. The main problem is the carousel on it can only take a few rounds of ammunition, and you've got to decide before you go in what sort of ammunition you're going to have in your carousel. You've then also got to wait for the main gun to come back to the horizontal position before it can be loaded by the automatic loader. The driver is completely isolated from the two-man, the gunner and the tank commander in the turret. He sits right up front all by himself, and he's completely isolated from the vehicle. He relies on the intercom system to keep in touch with the commander of the vehicle. Commander has very little to do because he is looking for targets. The gunner, he is just literally operating the gun itself. And again, the vehicle would come out of action, the carousel would be reloaded with whatever ammunition is required for that particular engagement, and then the tank would re-enter the battle. One side of the vehicle has got storage lockers for extra equipment, spares and other bits and pieces like that, and the other side of the vehicle has all your external fuel cells with a very small internal fuel tank in the vehicle itself. This helps drop the height of the T-72 quite dramatically by 2 or 3 feet compared to a Chieftain or a Challenger tank. But it's very crudely made, very crudely cast. It's a cast turret on the T-72, but an incredible turn of speed. It relies upon its light mobility and high speed to keep it out of danger against the modern Challenger, the M1 Abrams.
T-72 main battle tank. These were introduced into the Russian Army in the early 70s, from 1973 onwards. This particular example was built somewhere between 1975 and 79. They would have been built either in Russia or under license in either Poland or Czechoslovakia. This particular example is Russian and was probably built at the Russian tank factory in Nizhny Tagil, factory number 183, otherwise known as Vagonka. This particular example weighs about 41.5 tons. The gun is a 125mm smoothbore tank gun, and the maximum speed of the tank is about 60 kilometers an hour on the road. The engine is again the ubiquitous V12 Russian diesel engine, 39 litres, but this time supercharged to increase the power to 780 horsepower. This particular example was in service with the East German Armed Forces, we think possibly used as a training tank, and was gifted to the museum in the mid-90s, early 90s, as a result of the reunification of Germany.
T-72 was a much more modern tank. Even today, it's still considered a very, very powerful tank. All the laser range finding, thermal imaging, night vision equipment is carried on different versions of the T-72. The tanks have a very, very low silhouette, and in T-72s they actually did away with one of the crew members. The way they did away with the crew member is actually put auto load on the tanks. They have got a system at the bottom of the turret that picks up ammunition and loads it into the main gun, so you don't need a loader. Auto load, they can pick between high explosive, armour piercing, discarding sabo, high explosive anti-tank or heat. One of the big problems when we faced the Republican Guard in Iraq was the Republican Guard were equipped with the best tanks the Iraqis had, and the best tanks the Iraqis had were the T-72s. I wouldn't say they were a feared tank, but they were dealt with great respect, and it's not the sort of tank that you take lightly. They're a very competent tank, and the British knew it and the Americans knew it, and that's why they dealt with them with helicopter gunships and smart bombs and dropped them straight on the top. Even in Baghdad themselves, where there was issues where the Iraqis had put tanks in sensitive places near buildings, schools, what the Americans actually did, they dropped concrete bombs, which was basically 1.5 ton of concrete guided bomb, and dropped it straight on the tank rather than giving collateral damage, blowing up buildings all around. It's surprising for the Americans to worry about it, but basically they did. And these concrete bombs were very successful, and a lot of them were targeted against T-72s just to get rid of the threat of that tank. After a while, the Iraqis realised that the safest place to be in a tank was away from it, because if you were anywhere near your tank, thermal imaging on the Allied side put them at such an advantage, and they could see you and you couldn't see them. But the T-72 tank to tank is a very competent tank. The speed and agility of a T-72 is exceptional. They're very, very good tanks across country. They've got a very good turn of speed. They handle very well, and they're reasonably comfortable for the crews, unlike the T-55s and 62s. If you drive a T-55 for 50 miles, someone will need to pick you out of the seat because it's that tiring to drive. But a T-72, you could probably go and play a football match afterwards. It's a big difference. They thought about what was going to be going on and where they was actually going to use them. Again, T-72s have all-weather, all-terrain capabilities, NBC, nuclear, biological, protected. They're very competent tanks. They've got every modification that the T-55s were lacking, and they've done very good work on the tank to bring it to a standard where it's a competent, modern main battle tank.
T-72 is quite an aggressive tank to drive. I class it as being a boy racer of a tank because it does move quite quickly. Being that it has quite a fast engine in it, it does manoeuvre quite happily over wide spaces. When you get into tight spaces, it can be quite a bit of a difficulty in moving and manoeuvring it about. The T-72 in conflict is quite a tight environment. As I said, the turret is quite small. Therefore, manoeuvring inside the turret is quite difficult for any of the crew members. The auto-changer that's in there did have the ability to accidentally catch hold of people and start to maim or cause them injury whilst inside and whilst in a battle environment. The T-72 that I've got originally came from Iraq. It was actually imported into this country and rebuilt by a UK dealer called Carl Brown. He then subsequently sold it to me. It has been in 2 movies since it's been in the UK. It's also been in a TV series, The Ultimate Force. The Russian tanks in the past few years have been quite easy to get hold of from former Soviet bloc countries, which is where one I own actually originally came from. The practicalities of owning it, obviously it's a large vehicle. It can only be manoeuvred on the UK roads via a low loader. I'm quite lucky in the respect that I actually own my own haulage firm, so I can manoeuvre all of my vehicles around using my own vehicles. People who don't have that luxury obviously find it very difficult, because there are very few people that can move something of that weight around.
The T-72 continued in service with the Russian Army through the 1970s and 80s and is to date still in service with countries across the world.
The Leningrad Kirov tractor factory has been producing or developing gas turbines since 1948, mainly for the Russian aviation industry, and eventually they produce gas turbines to power the Hind, the Hip and many other helicopters. And they take one of these engines and they drop it into the back of a T-64, and they decide this is the way to go. They again upgun it using the heavy tank factory's new turret, with the auto loader and the new 125mm gun. They change the transmission, they change the running gear, then change the track, and they end up with what becomes the T-80. So now the Russians have, for the first time in their history, 3 main battle tanks, all coming in out on the production line, all vying for the position of the Soviet tank. And the Soviet Politburo don't know what to do, because all 3 factories have got to be kept in production, because, you know, they've got thousands of workers tied up in these vehicles, and the Russians cannot afford unemployment. So they agree to go with the T-64, which is now upgunned to match the T-80 and the T-72. They also decide to go with the T-80 and keep the turbine and everything like that. They also decide that the T-72 will become part of the Russian army. It will be the second line. So in the front line, you're going to have the T-64 alongside the T-80. And then behind these, you're going to have the T-72. The T-80, they take it away, they play with it for a bit, but its fuel consumption is horrendous, 2 gallons to the mile. It's carrying 2,500 litres of fuel just to do the same range as the T-72 with 1,600 litres of fuel on board. So it's something that really does need looking at. Do the Soviets really need an extra 5 miles an hour and 4 tons in weight just to have a gas turbine in their tank? And the answer to that is no, they don't.
When you get to the T-80s, you're talking over 1,000 brake horsepower. The speed of the tank is pretty much shattering. I mean, the speed of 40 plus miles per hour, pretty much over any terrain. The suspension is exceptionally good, very soft for the crew, keeps the crew really awake, really. I mean, you know, that it's not tiring to be in the tanks.
The T-80 goes into Chechnya and becomes known as the scrap heap and the scrap yard of Chechnya because it was put out of action by a simple Molotov cocktail on the engine deck because the turbine sucked in so much air that it would explode as it sucked in the petrol from the Molotov cocktail. So 1 pint of petrol and a bit of sand all of a sudden blow up a 2.2 million tank. So they go back to the basic diesel engine T-72, bring it in, and that is what is basically doing the bulk of the fighting in Chechnya to this day. The Soviets, having got 3 main battle tanks on the battle area, they now need to standardize. This is all against the ethos of the Russian army. They usually have a set piece of equipment, like the AK-47, which dominates the Russian army, the MiG, which dominates the Russian Air Force. And in the tank world, they need to do this. They've got to get rid of the T-64, the T-80, and the T-72. They've got to standardize. And in 2002, what the Soviets say is, we are going to develop a new tank. And along comes the T-90. And all they've really done is taken the best parts from the T-64, the T-80, and the T-72, pull them all together in one lump, and they've produced the T-90. And the T-90 is now slowly coming into Soviet service as their main battle tank. It will replace all the others eventually, but because of the economic constraints placed upon the Soviet army, they're only buying about 180 tanks a year. Now, considering the Soviet army's got over 4,000, this is going to take them a long time to get standardization within the Soviet army, which will cut down on the number of spare parts, it'll cut down on all the different training and many other things, and will give the Soviet army exactly what it wants: standardization, simplicity. T-90, a lot of it comes from the T-72, but with the 1991 Iraq War, the T-72 got one horrendous name because Challenger and the M1 Abrams were picking them things off at 3 miles in the dark, and they were getting first round on target every time. The T-72 didn't have a hope in hell against that type of accuracy with basic infrared night fighting. Now, what the Soviets do is they go back, they put all this thing together and come out with a T-90, and for the first time ever, on the T-90, you now have thermal imaging, which gives these Soviet tanks a new dimension. And That way then you can find your enemy before your enemy can find you. And this is where the T-90 is trying to cure all these different ills. It's trying to bring the Soviet army up to spec so it can cope with Challenger and Abrams and Leopard 2 and the Leclerc, the new French tank as well, which is again coming on stream. Black Eagle is a development of the T-80. The T-80 cost over $2.2 million. It's too expensive for the majority of countries. Also, the turbine was an absolute dog of an engine, so they swapped that over to a nice standard diesel engine. But what they've done with the turret is quite dramatic on the Black Eagle. And what they've done is they've gone over to a NATO-style system of compartmentalized ammunition stowage. They've got a huge bustle on the back of the tank now, just like on the Challenger and on the M1 Abrams and on the Leopard 2. So the ammunition can be literally palletized and put into the back of the turret very, very quickly. It's got a brand new autoloader to deal with this compartmentalized ammunition storage, and its rate of fire is now between 10 and 12 rounds a minute, which compared to the T-72 and the basic T-80 of 4 to 5 rounds a minute is a dramatic improvement. It really is. Next thing they did in the turret is they compartmentalized the actual crew themselves. So if there is a penetration of an anti-tank round into the turret, then one person only will be knocked out, or he will be wounded. But the other guy on the other side of the turret will be protected because he's now inside a titanium bath. And it makes for a lot safer environment for the crew. But the only trouble is now you've lost that camaraderie within the tank itself, because the driver now is up front all by himself in his little armoured box. You've got the commander in his little armoured box, and you've got the gunner in his little armoured box. But that is the way this Black Eagle development is going. Whether or not it's ever going to make the world market is another thing altogether. It's very, very expensive. It's more expensive than a basic T-80. There has been no sign of it at the present moment. A couple of mock-ups, about 5 mock-ups have been seen at various armaments exhibitions around the world. But that's as far as anybody knows about this vehicle. Speed, all the rest of it, nobody has a clue, because it's basically a brand new T-80 with a brand new engine and a brand new turret. Whether it will sell, nobody knows at the moment. We've gone round this many, many times. The tank arrives on the battlefield, then by the end of World War II, everybody's saying, the guided missiles, king of the battlefield. The tank is dead, long missile. By 1960, everybody's saying, oh, hang on, no, it's not. Missiles aren't that great. And once we fire them, what do? So then the tank comes back again. And now you've got great machines like the M1 Abrams, like the Challenger, like the new Russian T-90 and the Leclerc and so on. And these tanks are going to dominate the battlefield. With the new type of protection measures like explosive armor, like the new arena system and infrared sensors built into the turrets for automatic smoke discharging, which both NATO and the Soviets are all developing. The tank is now survivable on the modern battlefield. It will dominate because you have to have a big machine to break through a defensive structure. Yes, the Air Force can do it to a certain extent, but you still need a man on the ground in a big ugly machine to take that first breakthrough. Then the man up with his boots will come along in his Bradley or his Warrior or his BMP-3, and he will deploy behind the tanks and he will take and hold the ground. But he needs that big machine up front, because if he runs into a guy who happens to have a 20mm cannon on a Toyota pickup, he is very, very vulnerable. But you put a main battle tank in front of him, he is now survivable. So it's very much an integrated battlefield. That is how it's going to go, where the soldier on the ground is going to be able to look at an object like a Scud missile launcher, like an artillery battery. He will then be able to talk the pilots in from his position. The pilots will then see live video from his helmet cam of the position. They will then bomb it. Then will come the tanks and the armoured personnel carriers, and the position will be taken. That is how the modern battlefield is going to go. It's going to go electronic.